Okay, so I'd like to welcome everyone today to the carbon farming webinar. Hopefully you'll find it exciting and very informative as well. My name's Lee Nugent, so I'm the Rural Agriculture Land Care Facilitator for Gulf Savannah NRM. So a bit of a mouthful, but that basically goes down to Ralph, so that's my position here. So I'll be your host for today's webinar. I just wanted to let you all know as well that this is being recorded, so hopefully that's okay with everybody. Has anyone got any issues with that?
No.
No? Okay, great. Very good. All right. So basically, we'll just start. All right, so I'd like to say a quick welcome to country. So I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands of the Northern Gulf and pay our respects to the elders also. In particular, I acknowledge the Mullaridgee people as traditional custodians of the land we're coming to you from today. All right, so I'll get into the presenter introduction. So first off the mark, our first presenter is John McLaughlin. So John McLaughlin, he works for, or he's the carbon project manager for Upscale Carbon, and he'll be talking about vegetation methods in carbon farming today. So Daryl Killin is our second speaker, and he is the director of the Carbon Hub, and he'll be speaking about Savannah burning methods in carbon farming. All right, our third speaker we have is Matthew Harrison. So Matthew is the Director of the Carbon Storage Partnership Systems with University of Tasmania and Tasmanian Institute of Agriculture. So he'll be talking about soil carbon and soil carbon markets. Alex Cummins and Callum Morrison, hopefully I pronounced that okay. They're our fourth and final speakers today. So they're from the Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water. And they'll be talking about Chubb review findings, upcoming reviews and regulations, and the upcoming carbon scheme this year. All right, so our first presenter, John, I'll just give you a little bit of a background about each presenter before they start their presentations. As well, I forgot to mention at the start, if anyone does have any questions for the presenters, if you could put it into the chat box and I'll actually read them out at the end of each presentation. So yeah, if you could do that, that would be great. So I'll start off with John. So John is the project manager at Upscale Carbon, a carbon service provider that assists grazers across Queensland to undertake carbon farming projects with the Australian government. Upscale Carbon specialises in delivering vegetation method carbon projects and is currently working with numerous graziers in the Northern Gulf region. Before this, John spent many years working as a grazing land management extension officer in the Gulf. So I'd like to pass over to John, who'll be talking, as I mentioned earlier, about vegetation methods in carbon farming. Thanks, John. I'll just stop sharing my screen so you can share yours.
You're muted, John. Yep, that's all good.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Thank you for that. Good afternoon, everybody. As Leah mentioned, I'm going to be talking about the vegetation methods in carbon farming. I've tailored this so that we're looking specifically at sort of projects and methodologies that are relevant to the Gulf Savannah region or the Northern Gulf region, depending on what language we're using these days. I've already had a bit of an introduction, so it's not really worth going into too much, but essentially Upscale Carbon, we're a service provider that helps graziers or landholders in general conduct carbon farming projects with the Australian government's emissions reduction fund, and then I do a bunch of other sort of grazing, got a bunch of other grazing commitments across Queensland. I'm in the Central Queensland Beef Research Committee. I'm part of the Lucina network. I do some work with MLA, and so I've got a good understanding of grazing systems and the grazing industry more generally. Considering on first up, I thought I'd just quickly give a really brief overview of carbon farming, which refers specifically to land-based carbon projects. In other words, those that are relevant to graziers and farmers, and that's sort of why we've got the speakers and the topics that we have today lined up, I'm assuming. And they include those activities or methods that store carbon in vegetation or soil, or reduce emissions from animal production systems. And as I mentioned, I'm going to be focusing on the vegetation methods, so storing carbon in vegetation biomass. These are your HIR and environmental planting type methodologies, and it's probably the most common method used across Australia in terms of carbon farming. We've got a soil carbon method speaker on today as well, and some Savannah methods. And the other last one there that we're really touching on today, and this is the agricultural methods that focus on emissions reduction by having a more productive herd, so less emissions per kilogram of beef produced. I'm going to be focusing on the vegetation methods, and so I'll get straight into it. So vegetation projects generate abatement by removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and storing it as carbon in plants as they grow. So it's as simple as that. Trees draw down carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through photosynthesis, and they use photosynthesis to produce various carbon-based sugars that are necessary for tree functioning. And quite literally, every part of the tree stores carbon from the trunks, branches, leaves, and roots. And so as a grazier, doing a vegetation method project, you are providing a service in taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and storing it in vegetation on your property, growing vegetation on your property. The methods are rather extensive. There's 15 unique methods in total under the vegetation method category. The most common one that you would hear about in the Gulf Savannah region is HIR, or human-induced regeneration, but there's obviously a couple of others listed there, and then, yeah, 15 in total. Vegetation methods for Gulf Savannah producers. What determines the right vegetation method for your property, or the vegetation method for your property that might be viable, comes down to a variety of factors. So it will depend on your location, your production system, your climate, your vegetation community, your vegetation mapping, and importantly, what the future goals and plans that you have for your business and your land are. So there are a lot of things to consider when determining which vegetation method is right for you, or simply which vegetation method might produce a viable project on your property. And in the extensive forested country that most of the Gulf Savannah region is sort of located in, HIR would be the most appropriate method. So it's likely to be the most relevant for our conversation. If your property has category X or category white country, according to your PMAV, any of the avoided methodologies, your avoided clearing, avoided deforestation, may be worth looking into. And if you're closer to the tablelands or you're in a more intensive system, environmental planting projects might also be relevant to you. But as I've tried to tailor this to the sort of the Gulf Savannah region more broadly, I think it's worth focusing on HIR, which is probably most relevant to the people on our call today. So these numbers might be a little bit dated, but I doubt they've changed a whole lot. About 1/3 of all projects registered with the Emissions Reduction Fund are HIR projects, and just under 30% of all ACCUs, Australian Carbon Credit Units, or carbon credits, as people might interchangeably sort of say throughout the presentations, almost 30% have come from HIR projects. So this is a rather common method used across Australia, and there's been plenty of ACCUs generated from it from across Queensland, especially down in Western Queensland, and increasingly more in North Queensland. Ideal HR method is ideal for properties that are large in size and located in areas that have forest potential. When we say forest potential, we just are basically saying environments or ecosystems that naturally grow trees, which, as I'm sure for most producers or people out in the Northern Gulf region, it's indicative of most properties across the Northern Gulf. Large properties can grow trees. Those are the sort of two boxes that you need to tick right off the gun when it comes to HIR. So how does it work? HR projects involve regenerating native forests by making changes to land management practices. You'll see I put changes in bold there, and I'll touch on why I've done that. It's designed to be carried out in areas where vegetation has historically been impacted by grazing, clearing, and other activities which suppress the potential growth of trees. And the projects themselves incentivize landholders to implement new management activities that are designed to ensure vegetation regeneration reaches forest cover. So the changes involved, the new involved, and I'll touch on why that is. What do we mean by forest cover? When the Clean Energy Regulator mentions that, if you ever sit in on any of these presentations to do with veg methods, that's the common phrase, forest cover. It is referring to 20% of canopy cover when looking at trees that are above 2 meters tall. So bird's eye view of a landscape, you look in the amount of the ground that is taken up by the canopy cover and only looking at trees above 2 meters, that needs to be below 20% to be included in a HIR project. And the goal of the project is to take it from below 20% up to 20%. It is not designed to generate wall-to-wall tree cover, 100% canopy cover, but ideally to encourage a healthy woodland ecosystem that's interspersed with productive pastures. And so the key things on this page is that you need to make changes to land management, looking for areas where tree regeneration has been suppressed in the past due to clearing, grazing, whatever it is, and that hasn't already reached that definition of forest cover, that 3% cover. Additionality. It's a term we use to refer to change or the newness of activities. So it's not money for nothing. You need to make that very clear at the get-go. So landholders are required to undertake eligible activities in accordance with the project's elected carbon method, which is HIR in the case that I'm referring to, and demonstrate additionality while also preserving the stored carbon in the landscape. And for a HIR project, as a grazier who is participating in a HIR carbon methodology, you need to say that you're going to do one of these, one or more of these 5 listed activities that you weren't already doing before. So excluding livestock, changing or managing the timing and extent of grazing, so changing your grazing pressure and extent effectively, managing feral animals in a humane manner, not as relevant to the Northern Gulf, managing plants that are not native, and making a decision to permanently cease chemical or mechanical destruction. Managing feral animals makes a lot of sense if you're down in Western Queensland, you've got feral goats coming through your property and they're mitigating or suppressing any new tree regeneration. Probably not relevant up in the Northern Gulf. Managing plants that are not native, so your invasive plant trees that you could, in certain instances, replace those invasive trees with native trees, not as relevant in the Northern Gulf. And given the amount of bee or blue country across the Northern Gulf with very few opportunities for chemical or mechanical suppression or destruction of regrowth, they're not relevant. So these are the only two that generally are applicable to graziers in the Northern Gulf, and I would dare say that not many people are too interested in excluding livestock from their properties. So realistically, the main management activity in terms of eligibility would be changing the way that you manage your cattle so that you're modifying that timing and extent of grazing. I'm rushing through them because we've got a strict time to keep to. If you were going to do a HIR carbon project or a carbon project more generally, these would be your 9 quick steps. I think I've actually missed number 8 there, so it might be 8 steps. You'd make an initial inquiry to a service provider and they would discuss what sort of potential methods may be viable on your property. They'd run through, in this case, HIR, what is the method and what are its requirements? And then you'd simply pass along your lot and plan details to them. they'd run what we call it upscale carbon, a rapid assessment, which gives us an indication of if there is even the chance of a project being viable on your property. If there is, we go through to the next stage, which is a feasibility assessment, which is a rather rigorous online assessment of your property to get a decent idea or a ballpark idea of the total project accuse that would be available running a project on your property, which enables us to work out the viability. And from there, you would sign a contract with the service provider. That would provide some assurance that the company you've signed with will be your elected service provider once the project is approved with the Clean Energy Regulator. From there, conditionally registering a project with the Australian government. And then you get into the really nitty-gritty tough stuff of the carbon project registration process. You prepare a property management plan that describes exactly how you're going to manage the timing and extent of grazing to reach that 20% canopy cover, in line with how they ensure that they don't lose out on agricultural production in the meantime. Seeking consent from eligible interest holders. If you have a native title determination and you're on leasehold land, you'll need consent from them. Banks also, in most cases, have to provide their consent. So you go through that process, which can take months, if not years. On-ground certification exercise is where we go out and ground truth feasibility assessment data, essentially. We do up to 200 sort of site assessments on a property. It's field work, it's rigorous, and we can begin to implement our project activities.
You're at
Once
10
we
minutes
sort of
now, John.
Rightio. Once we've kicked off sort of especially each of these three, we can then apply for unconditional registration, and the project is essentially by then formally registered. Once that is done, you're involved in a carbon project, and you'll have to continue to implement the project activities that you lined out in your property management plan. The property management plan is a co-designed process between the service provider and the landholder. The landholder ultimately shapes it, decides how they can fit in with the project activities and the future direction of their business. The service provider is providing guidance on what is a requirement under their chosen method and what sort of activities that they need to do to be eligible. And so there's a nice little yin and yang there between the landholder deciding what they need to do and the service provider providing the guidance on what they need to do for a project to be registered. That's all happening, and along the way, your service provider is providing support to submit offset reports, which lead to the generation of accuse. And there's also audits being conducted by independent auditors to make sure and regularly conduct assurances that the integrity of the credits issued in the project is present. And so that's sort of the 8 key steps. I've gone from 7 to 9 there, so I must have deleted something. The parent company or the sister company, I'm not quite sure the relationship, with Upscale Carbon owns a couple of properties across Queensland, a couple of them with existing carbon projects on them. The most relevant one would be Crowley Station based in Croydon. So I can use the numbers because I'm not really revealing anything besides our own information on exactly how some of this stuff looks for you. Property size, 68,000 hectares. What you're seeing on the right here is the results of that feasibility assessment, stage 3, where we get a breakdown of what land is, the greens here, the dark green and the light green, is deemed as not eligible to earn carbon credits from because it is above 20% canopy cover. So it's already at forest potential, or forest cover, sorry, straight away excluded. Yellow areas are the areas that we call here CEA, carbon estimation area. That is areas that is below 20% canopy cover, that has the potential to reach 20% canopy cover within the timeframes of the project. See here that we have just shy of 11,000 hectares of that. So it's only about 12, 13, 14% of the entire property that is eligible for the project and that we can earn carbon credits from. These are where our carbon activities will be focused within. As you can see, with a yield of 1.01, I don't have the time to sort of run into it, so what that number is suggested feasibility stage 3, that this project could earn just over 270,000 carbon credits in the duration of its lifetime, which at the current price of $38.25 would be about $10 million over the 25 years. If we use today's price, there's predictions and forecasts all over the place that suggest that the carbon credit price could reach as high as $100 by 2030, which would obviously change this number drastically. What we can provide as service providers isn't assurances around price, it's assurances or some assurance around the amount of credits we're able to generate. And so that 270,000 number is the number we're comfortable with in terms of predicting exactly what the price will be over the next 25 years. We have to rely on other people for that. What was done, or what is being done on Killin Station, just west of Croydon there, to be eligible under the HR methodology, we are managing the timing and extent of grazing. So that's where the change has come in on that topic. What are they doing? Implementing new dams, I think between 10 and 20 over the duration of the project to spread grazing pressure across the property. We're modifying the grazing strategy to spell country that has been degraded over time and allowed regeneration. We're implementing and upkeeping fire breaks around CEA areas, particularly around these yellow areas, as you can see on the map. Protect new tree growth from potential wildfires that can come in from the north and especially other properties in the area, and implementing hazard reduction burns as needed to protect against hot fires that can result from a large fuel load and threaten these yellow areas and the new tree regeneration. Those are the sorts of practices that we're implementing, which you can see it's not a drastic, radical sort of change to your grazing management. It's just a slight change now that we're valuing new tree growth and putting a dollar figure on that. That's just a photo of me out in the field, or my buggy out in the field as we're going around surveying sites, doing the on-ground stratification exercise. That's me done. That's my little 2-metre pole there that we need to see if trees are included in the project or not included in the project. And I think I've snuck in under 15 or bang on 15.
Yeah,
I'm going to answer any questions now. Yeah, or at the end, or obviously feel free to email me any questions if we don't have time to do it on this message.
Yeah, no, it should be okay. There's 3 questions there, so we'll just do it now. That's fine. So we have the first question is from, Matt Harrison. So how do we distinguish between human-induced and natural regeneration? And is there scope for gaming this method, classifying natural re-veg as human-induced?
Yeah, look, essentially, don't know if there's necessarily a method for making that distinction. Climate Friendly did a fair bit of data to try to, with CSIRO, and I can send you through the little fact sheet that they've got on properties that they've done carbon projects on, and looked at the sort of 10-year baseline period of forest cover across their country, or total canopy cover across their country, to ensure that the change in management was actually the uptick in total canopy cover across their property. And I've actually seen that it's that in most cases it actually is a rather it is due to the change in management rather than the natural vegetation. You're not going to be able to pick up every instance and specifically allocate certain tree growth to natural re-veg or from the HR project, but you would expect in these areas that anything that hasn't been suppressed by some sort of management practices in these locations where the veg community would lead itself to be forest cover, if left alone, would already be at forest cover if there wasn't a management sort of influence involved there. In terms of the estimation of the carbon yield, this is all done through FullCam, which is just online government software. So across a property like Killin, they will take, using GIS sort of points, they'll take about 400 sample points from within the CEA area and take the average of the yield across that region.
All right, great.
So there's a massive GIS component to this before you get out on the ground and begin to ground truth things, because even though GIS is expensive, it's a lot more expensive to have 6 people out in buggies in the middle of the bush for 2-3 weeks at a time. So we rely heavily on the GIS before we can get any ground truth done.
Great. Thanks a lot, John. Yeah, we'll just be aware of time and that sort of thing as well. But I do have a couple more questions there. So anyone that did put questions up, I'll just leave them till the end now. So yeah, definitely put them up in the chat box, but we'll just keep the time. And so thank you, John. Thanks for your time. So what I'll do now is I'll just reshare my screen.
Oh.
All right, so our next presenter we have is Daryl Killin. So Daryl graduated from the University of Melbourne with a Bachelor of Forest Science honours on April 1993. So since 2015, he has branched out into supporting Savannah burning carbon abatement projects covering almost 3 million hectares of Cape York Peninsula, many of which are Indigenous run projects. So now I'll hand over to Daryl to talk about Savannah burning methods in carbon farming. Thanks, Daryl.
Thanks very much, Leah, and just like to acknowledge the traditional owners. Just going to share my screen. Can you see that?
Yeah, we can see that. That's perfect.
Okay, so the burning question of Savannah. It's all about fire. As indicated, I've been working in the Savannah fire abatement space since 2015. I'm actually a practitioner in the field. I've got my aerial and secondary ticket, and I support a lot of the operations directly, so organising the burn plans, executing the burn plans, as well as writing the offsets reports and supporting projects to generate carbon credits. So that's taken me all over the Cape during that time period and exposed me heavily to the specifics of the method. So why do you get carbon credits to burn? It's a good question, because usually a fire generates emissions. So people often are not sure why we get carbon credits. Basically, you get carbon credits for reducing greenhouse gases from shifting the seasonality of fire, reducing the late dry season fires, so particularly fires in September, October, November, which can spread for weeks and burn a lot of country. Hang on, what's going on here? I don't know why sorry, I don't. So I just, for some reason, it's going forward and it shouldn't be. So yeah, we reduced the late dry season fires and against a baseline. The 4 different categories of fuel loads that worked out in the method are fine, coarse, heavy and shrub fuels. So basically we're looking at the proportion of grass really that burns in the first method, and there's a new method coming out at the moment that's looking at sequestration as well. So that's the timber, the increase in the timber on the country. So you'll see there the change in baseline. A typical project, you have a baseline period where you compare the amount of fire you had in the past, and then you implement the change in activity, which is doing the early strategic burning and creating fire breaks, so that when those late fires start, they go up against the fire breaks and go out, and then you have a reduction in emissions from using fire. So we're using fire to reduce fire. That's basically the method, and you get paid for the reduction in those emissions associated with having less fire on your country. So, and of course, the fire that we are having on the country is more cool burning. It's those winter burns, and a reduction in the late dry season. It doesn't mean necessarily that you can things like storm burning and you can undertake those, and areas that include Melaleuca or grasslands are actually excluded from the method. So that sort of country, if you're worried about woody thickening in that country, you can actually execute hot burns, but of course you've got to have your breaks in place if you're going to take on a hot burn or a storm burn. So yeah, obviously we've been doing fire all over the country for a long time, and traditional owners were doing a lot of fire back in the day, and we've probably heard of these books. I work a lot with Indigenous groups all over the north. That heat map you can see there sort of looks at the overall fire or the potential of generating carbon credits from fire. So the red areas have the greatest potential and the green areas have the least. And you'll see there that there is actually a lower potential for the application of this method in the Gulf region. There's a few more of the groups that I work with. So how do you burn? Basically, you can burn from quad bikes and aerial incendiary are the two main methods. There's an example of the aerial incendiary ignition that happens. There's potassium permanganate in the balls and that gets injected with ethylene glycol, and 20 seconds later on the ground, the ball ignites. And that's how you start a fire. So we don't, that's the housing that's used to drop the balls down. So we don't actually light fires from the chopper, the fire starts on the ground. So what are the current methods? So at the moment, the current method is emissions avoidance only. So you're looking at doing burns before the end of July. And those burns, as I said, are often cool. You've got more dew and the flame height's a lot lower. And traditionally, this has been done in high rainfall areas. So the new method that's coming on board is going to be looking at sequestration. So that's the woody storage that's left behind from fire and keeping it there. So there is an increase in the coarse woody debris associated with doing this method. So it is important, if you don't want an increase in coarse woody debris, that you may not want to consider this particular method. So we now combine the new method, the 2023 method combines the grass credits changes, if you like, the emissions from burning grass earlier on in the year compared to later on in the year, combined with the sequestration or the carbon storage in the logs that increase on the ground, and the standing live biomass and the standing dead trees as well. So that method's currently under development right now as we speak, and it's just been held up by the Chubb review. There is also the 2018 method, but that's got a number of technical problems that are actually going to be superseded and fixed by this new 2023 method. Of course, one of the issues is with the carbon game is you've got to consider it's a long-term enterprise. So we're obviously looking at either a 25-year or a 100-year commitment. And obviously not many projects are interested in a 100-year commitment. Most people choose a 25-year crediting period. But it's important to understand with Savannah burning, if you do take on board the sequestration method, you must continue to do the activity pretty much for the next 25 years. And the activity is not just lighting fires, it is also fighting fires. So if you fight fires and put them out, you also earn credits. Obviously, playing with matches, you've got to be careful what you produce. This is the Arakoon wetlands actually, but they actually wanted a hot fire at that time. This is again a grassland that's not supposed to have trees. So, and on the top right there, you'll see a hot fire that's not desirable that went through an area up near Hopevale. So as I stated earlier, in our early burning, we have a low flame height, and we use dew obviously in the morning, and in the winter months you get more dew, so the fires go out overnight. On the left-hand side, you've got the coarse woody debris I was talking about that we tend to increase by using the method. And on the right-hand side is obviously a hot late fire that obviously it would lose you carbon credits. So the left-hand side gains your carbon credits, the right-hand side loses carbon credits. Things like, smoldering logs can burn for weeks, as you'll probably know, and they can start a fire. So you think a fire's out sometimes, and then it'll sneak up behind you a couple of weeks later and continue to burn. So as I said, firefighting is an important element of this method. And up in the Cape, we use leaf blowers very effectively to put late fires out. You'll see there on the left-hand side, that's a fire break put up near actually near Kendall River Station during the night when the flame height was low, and we effectively put out about 3 kilometres of a fire front overnight and put that fire out just using leaf blowers with that and blowing that fuel load. Just that 1 metre fire break pulled it up. We've obviously got to think about, as I said, different vegetation types, because when you've got your melaleuca and your tea tree, obviously that country is wetter, so it doesn't burn early in the dry season, but then later on it dries out and you get those late fires sneaking through little gaps like this. So sometimes we do have to join up these two areas on the left and the right. Here you'll see woodland. You sometimes got to make sure that you don't leave wicks like this exposed where you can get a fire coming through. There is some early evidence that it's also good for biodiversity, but this hasn't yet to be verified, and there's new methods coming to look at that. So where could you burn? As stated before, this method is concentrated in the high rainfall zones, but you can do it down to a 600 mil rainfall zone. So there's the two zones at the moment. There's the high rainfall zone, and I obviously work in the Cape York Peninsula area above 1,000 mils largely. But there is this lower rainfall belt between 600 mil and 1,000 mil rainfall that is available to do carbon farming for the Savannah method, but we haven't seen a lot of projects start up in that part of the world, and that's probably because the baselines have been lower, because fires are not as prevalent down there, and it's also often harder to join up your early scars, and obviously graziers don't always want to burn grass in the winter either. So this method, it probably has limited application in the Gulf region, but there may be a couple of small areas where it could be undertaken.
You're at 10 minutes now, Daryl.
Sure, thank you. So you've got different vegetation types there. We've got the Cape York vegetation types, and then we've got the vegetation types that get categorized by the method there around woodland with mixed grass, woodland with tussock grass, open woodland. Now, I looked at a couple of little projects there. So that's what's called the CLCAC project. I look back with them. I did some work back in 2016 looking at viability, and you'll see there late fire frequency. There's a bit of capacity there on the eastern side and the western side, but most of that late fires, if you'll see here on the left-hand side, you've got the 2000 to 2009, there were more late fires. That's fires from the 1st of August onwards. But since 2013, and because of all the improved fire management, we've actually seen a reduction in the amount of late fires anyway. So a lot of the baseline for this area has been reduced by not having that capacity, not having fires come through anymore. I also looked at another area in the west of the Gulf, and you'll see there again, in the fire frequency from 2000 to 2009, there was late fires around Robinson River and Westmoreland, but again, in the last 10 years, the amount of late fires has actually reduced. So with this method, you actually need to have a history of bad fire in order to start it. Having said that, there are new programs out, including the Land Restoration Fund and new methodologies under Accounting for Nature, whereby improvements in environmental condition associated with fire management are going to be paid on top of carbon credits. So where there may be some future capacity, and look, we'd have to look at this a bit closer from a feasibility perspective, but if you combined a carbon project with Savannah with co-benefits payments for improved ecological condition around wetlands and riparian areas, there are new methods coming out that give you payments that are unrelated to the carbon. So they're just payments for improvement of ecological condition from using fire. And Accounting for Nature has a number of methods that are going to come out in the next few months with regard to that. So yeah, as I said, I'm a practitioner in the field. I'll be frank and say to you that there is probably limited capacity for projects in the Gulf probably some of the higher rainfall areas above 1,000 mil might be appropriate. But I really think we may need to consider these environmental biometrics that are coming up before anyone seriously looked at savanna burning in this part of the world. Okay, that's me.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot for that, Daryl. That was a really good presentation. So yeah, as I said again before, we'll leave the questions till the end, but I can see them piling up in the chat box there. So I will move on to the next presenter. And the next presenter is Matthew Harrison. Sharing my screen.
If you want to stop sharing when you're ready, Leah,
Yeah.
I can try to share my screen. It could go catastrophically wrong, but have a go.
Yeah, no, that's right. I'll just do a little bit of an intro for you, and then you're right to start. So I'll just share this bit for a minute. So yeah, basically, Matt's internationally renowned for his work in improving the sustainability of agricultural and land use systems through innovative economic, environmental, and social solutions to demand-driven problems. So Matt is also the director of the Carbon Storage Partnership. So thanks, Matt. Yeah, I'll hand over to you to talk about soil carbon and soil carbon markets.
Thanks very much, Lisa, and thanks very much to you and the Gulf Savannah for the invitation to present today. And thanks also everyone else for attending. I know you're busy and time is precious these days, so thanks for your time. I'll see if I can share my screen. Hopefully you can see that now. Can people see that or not? There's a little bit of a lag in the line. So I'm an associate professor at the University of Tasmania, but I've worked in carbon and greenhouse gas emissions for over 20 years, mainly with practitioners, with industry and government stakeholders, and I've helped co-form government policies as well as RDC, Research Development Corporation priorities. I've called this presentation Science or Snake Oil, and it's interesting to see that Daryl's conclusion aligns perfectly with what my conclusion was, which I can say it now, but I'll get to it at the end, is practitioners are better off focusing on natural capital, environmental stewardship, and sustainability in general, rather than carbon per se. So where the markets will go and where consumer demand will go in the next 5 or 10 years will be more towards environmental stewardship, and that's exactly what the Land Restoration Fund is getting at and accounting for nature. And so improvement of environmental stewardship through vegetation and soils and grazing management is more likely to attract public good as opposed to carbon, which carbon is part of it, it's part of the puzzle, but where it will probably go in future is more towards holistic environmental management rather than just carbon. So there's essentially 7 main messages that I want to talk about. I'll have to be quick in this presentation, but I do a lot of work on greenhouse gas emissions mitigation, in particular soil carbon. So soil carbon markets tend to focus on permanence. So that means you have to have that carbon out of the atmosphere for 25 or 100 years in the case of the Commonwealth Government. So that's called permanent. So in other words, the CO2 is out of the atmosphere. But short-term carbon is that has the greatest fertility benefits, which will advantage pasture growth. So there's essentially 3 main types of carbon. I won't go into the details. One is a very quick turnover one called particulate organic carbon, or POC. Then there's a medium-term one called humus, and that can last for up to 40 years in the soil, generally less. And then there's a stable one, and that can last up to 500 or even 1,000 years. And that's sort of like charcoal, and that's derived from fires. But the charcoal-derived form, resistant carbon, has no value for plant growth at all. It's basically a lump of charcoal and doesn't really do much. Humus does have benefit, but it turns over faster. And the one that has the greatest benefit for plant growth and pasture production and therefore livestock feed is particulate organic carbon. So in terms of soil carbon markets, the point that I'm making is that we talk about permanence, but if you want to build up soil carbon, you have to build up this particulate organic fraction even though it's constantly cycling. So if it's cycling over 1 to 5 years, you have to build it up and keep it built up for at least 25 years, which is the minimum for a soil carbon market. So what are typical soil organic carbon levels in Australia, or more generally? Desert and degraded soils might have a soil organic carbon of less than 0.5%. You can have fire-derived forms of charcoal in the soil, and that might be up to 50%, but that's exceptional. Peat soils, for example, and these are mainly in Scotland and things, and you have peat bogs, they have more than 50% carbon, and they're sort of black soils. But most soils in Australia, and particularly in more extensive regions with lower rainfall, tend to be very low. So they might be 0.5% organic carbon. So that's a soil that has high organic carbon. You can generally tell by the colour. It's sort of a darker, that's a vertisol soil. A soil that's lower organic carbon might be a sandy or sort of a friable soil. That's actually called a calcareous, but that's got less than 0.5% organic carbon. So the second main message that I want to say is that regardless of whether or not anyone is in a soil carbon market, practices that improve soil organic matter should be encouraged. And the reason for that is because if you improve your organic matter, you generally improve the bugs, you improve the nutrients, you improve the chemistry of the soil, and therefore your productivity, your ability to grow stuff, improves. So it doesn't really matter whether or not you're in a soil carbon market. If you improve the productivity of your soil through improved organic matter, profitability tends to go up. And so there's lots of benefits of improved soil organic matter. In terms of greenhouse gas emissions, a 1% gain in soil organic carbon is 133 tonnes of CO2 out of the atmosphere. So it has a big effect, and that's what the government and all other markets are angling at, reduce global warming, which is fair. It also has drought resilience. So a 1% gain in soil organic carbon is 144,000 litres of water. So it holds on to water and enables that water to be available to plants when rainfall becomes sparse or you get a drought. And it also has chemical, biological and physical benefits. As I said before, if you increase soil organic matter and improve productivity, then it can pay for itself. If you improve productivity, therefore you can increase your pasture growth, increase productivity, increase livestock stocking rate, and therefore you can increase profitability. So that can lead to improved profit, but very much depends on where you are at the start. So you might say, well, what changes or practice changes should I do to improve soil organic matter? There's lots, but in terms of a Gulf region or in terms of an extensive region, you might look at reducing seasonal adaptation of stocking rates. So anything you can do to conserve ground cover, seasonal ground cover, and or reduce surface erosion or improve pasture species diversity or encourage growth or encourage surface cover, you'll generally improve soil organic matter. We've heard about Savannah fire management methods, and there's all sorts of other methods that not necessarily applicable to the Gulf, things like clay delving. We've heard about rangeland revegetation from John in the first presentation, and I would posit to say that rangeland revegetation, trees, probably have greater scope for improving carbon in the rangelands than do improvement in soil carbon. There are other ways to improve soil carbon, and that's a little bit, so we do a lot of on-farm experiments in Tasmania where I'm based, and so we're testing biochar as a feed supplement, and so they eat it, and the idea is that it improves live weight gain, reduces enteric methane, and improves soil carbon because it's undigestible. It goes out in their manure and they're basically a spreader. So that does improve soil carbon, just depends on your stocking rate. And if it's extensive, probably not much, but they're basically spreading out that biochar. It remains to be seen whether it improves live weight gain. We haven't actually measured a change, and we're not measuring enteric methane, but the manufacturers, which there are lots in Australia, claim that it reduces enteric methane. The third point that I want to make is that carbon markets attempt to decouple the effects of climate, which you can't change, from those in management, which you can change. So if you look at a long-term map of rainfall in Australia, and this is measured, I think, between 1900 and 2005, so it's more than 100 years. in the centre of Australia, you tend to get the lowest, between 50 and 100 millimetres, and you tend to get the highest around the edges. That's, of course, generalisation, but it's roughly right. If you look at soil carbon stocks at the continental scale, with red being very low and blue and dark blue being very high, you can see there's a very close similarity between them. So we've got 5 tonnes of soil carbon in the centre, roughly. We've got more than 200 tonnes of soil organic carbon near the edge, and that follows rainfall. So if you were wanting to improve soil carbon, where are you placed in the landscape, and what is the soil carbon in the environment around you? Because if you're naturally low, well, then you probably haven't got much scope for improving it. But if you're in an environment that's naturally high, well, then you might have scope for improving it. So picking on a land area that's been degraded has huge potential for improving soil carbon, because it can return to its natural state or an improved state, and therefore improve cover and then improve soil organic matter. The fourth point, sort of related to the third one, is that soil organic carbon is ephemeral. It comes and it goes. This is taken from my parents' farm, and it's obviously not in the Gulf, but it was really just to illustrate the point that between 9 months, there was a soil organic matter change of about 1%. And so that was in the previous year, and that was in the following winter. That's just all due to climate. That's nothing to do with management. So soil carbon will follow the climate. The other part that soil carbon markets talk about is permanence. So as I mentioned at the start, if you want permanent soil organic carbon, your practice change for whatever it was before has to be permanent. You can't change it for 2 years and then decide you'll change back again and expect soil organic carbon to keep changing. It won't. So if you think about where you are today, you might be 1.2% soil carbon at year 0. What soils actually have is they have an upper bound or a ceiling above which soil organic carbon can't really go above, and that's that blue line. Similarly, they have a lower bound, and so they can't actually go below that lower point. That's called the lower equilibrium. A typical paddock might be somewhere in between, and it goes down with drought, go up with La Nina, down with drought, and so on. If you were going to add nutrients or cut out cultivation or change your grazing management in some way, you could get soil carbon to go up and up and up. But similarly, if you let the land area degrade, or you excessively stocked it, or if you had an extended drought, it could go down. And there's nothing to say it could go up midway in a soil carbon market, and then you stop your practice change, and then it goes down again. The key point that people tend to overlook is that your ability to improve carbon depends on where you are today. So if you're already up near the top, if your soil has a high soil carbon, and then you enroll in the carbon market, well, you haven't got much scope to improve because you're up near the top. But if you're down near the bottom, soils that are near the bottom, you have huge potential to improve soil carbon because they've been degraded, and they can increase all that way to that upper ceiling. A farmer in Alice Springs said to me last year that the soil carbon markets make the good farmers bad and the bad farmers good. And by that she meant, well, if I've historically managed my country very well and I've built up the soil carbon, then I enroll in a soil carbon market, well, I haven't got much scope to improve, as opposed to someone who's let it degrade. Then I enroll in a soil carbon market and I've got huge scope to improve it. The sixth point is that climate change and soil carbon markets have to be a minimum of 25 years or up to 100 years. Climate change will reduce the potential to sequester carbon. So we've done a couple of newspaper articles. The Weekly Times contacted my group, and some of these are more recent than others. They were perhaps a little bit controversial with the titles, but the point was that soil carbon sequestration, the rate at which soil carbon will go up, will go down as the climate changes. So as the climate gets warmer, soils respire, they lose more carbon than they gain because things warm up. If rainfall changes, your ability to sequester carbon goes down. So we showed that in a 2050 climate, soil carbon sequestration is 55 to 133% lower than what it is today. I won't talk about that final point because that's exactly what I said at the start, which is we should be moving away from, this is the government and RDCs moving away from carbon payment policies towards natural capital environmental stewardship. And my final slide was that practices that improve soil organic carbon should be encouraged. Soil organic carbon tends to follow long-term rainfall. Soil carbon can be easily gained, but can be easily lost, for example, due to drought. So your returns from soil carbon markets can vary widely. There can be a huge gain or it can be a huge loss, depending on where you start. In terms of the tax implications, some costs associated with acquiring ACCUs, which is a carbon unit, are tax deductible, but the proceeds are also assessable income. And whether or not soil carbon markets are science or snake oil really depends on the motivation of the individual as well as the starting point. So I'll stop there, Leah.
Yeah, you're right. Thanks a lot for that, Matt. Just for everyone, just to be aware, we will be a little bit over time, so I hope that's not going to affect anyone too much. But we'll move on to our fourth and final presenters. So I'll just share my screen again. I'll just be a minute. All right, so our fourth and final presenter is Alex Cummins and Callum Morrison. So they're part of the small secretariat supporting the expert panel to deliver the 2022 independent review of Australian carbon credit units. As part of the secretariat, Alex and Callum work directly with panel members to identify opportunities for reform and to substantiate and inform the 16 recommendations made by the expert panel. They are currently working on the government's implementation of the recommendations. So I'll stop sharing my screen. I'll pass over to Alex and Callum. Thanks.
Thanks so much. I'll just, Alex is going to host a presentation. And I'm also joined by a colleague, Ben. And I just want to do a quick audio check with Ben.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you perfectly.
Great. All right.
So just while we're waiting for the slides to come up, so I'm joining from the traditional country of the Kaurna people on the Adelaide Plains. So just wanted to pay my respects to elders past and present.
Yeah.
Just skip through the slide 3, Ben, thank you. So thanks for the introductions previously as well by John, Daryl and Matt. So we've covered a lot of the basics of the carbon credit scheme. I just also wanted to touch on the fact that you earn ACCUs for projects that either store carbon or avoid emissions, and one ACCU is representative of 1 tonne of carbon dioxide either stored or avoided. And once you have ACCUs, you can sell them to generate income. You can either sell into the private market or you can sell to the Australian government, or you can choose to directly surrender your ACCUs so that you reduce your own carbon footprint. Next slide, thanks, Ben. So in order to earn ACCUs, you have to use an eligible method. We've heard about some of the methods today, like the vegetation methods, HIR, soil methods, and Savannah fire management methods. There's about 30 in all that you can take part of. And all methods must meet the offset integrity standards, which are a set of legislated standards that ensure that ACCUs represent real emission reductions. Next slide, thanks, Ben. So just on the back end.
Sorry, there's a bit of a lag.
Okay, that's right. On the back end, what's happening from the government side of things with a project? When you have a project, you register it with the Clean Energy Regulator, and once it's accepted, you'll undertake your project activities. Then you will provide an offset report to the Clean Energy Regulator, and if it's approved, you can earn ACCUs from those activities. And over the course of the life of a project, there'll be independent third-party audits at regular intervals. There'll be at least 3 over the life of a project, often more. And the first audit occurs before any credits are issued. Next slide, thanks, Ben. So the main thing that I'm here to talk about today is the independent review of carbon credit units. So this was a review, this was an election commitment by the Labor government at the previous federal election, and it was made with the understanding that after a decade of operation, there would likely be some opportunities to find improvements in the scheme. It was chaired by former Chief Scientist, Professor Ian Chubb, and he was accompanied by a small panel of experts, of which Alex and I and a small secretariat, of which Alex and I were both a part. There was around 215 written submissions, 30 in-person meetings, and site visits to HIR, avoided deforestation and landfill gas sites in making the recommendations, and it occurred over about 6 months. Next slide, thanks, Ben. Ultimately, the panel found that the scheme is sound and it has appropriate checks and balances at the scheme, method and project level to protect the integrity of the scheme and the credits that it creates. If I had to pick a theme for the review, it was probably the idea of continuous improvement. It was the panel's view that there were opportunities to update the scheme that would take into account more modern expectations of best practice, and that those updates would build trust and confidence in the scheme for the people that use it and other interested stakeholders. And really the recommendations that were made were based or informed by the views that were raised during consultation. And probably the key things that we heard are these ones that are on the screen here. There was lots of people that wanted enhanced transparency, clarification of the governance, and also to ensure that the scheme met the objectives of the legislation which allows its operation, the CFI Act, which also focuses on the obligation to abate carbon in a manner that protects Australia's environment and improves resilience to the effects of climate change. Next slide, thanks, Ben. So on the governance, a lot of these proposed changes they're happening in the background of the scheme, and they're really just been made to help build trust and integrity in the operation of the scheme. So the panel found that the scheme already has all the functions necessary for good governance, but recommended that the roles of scheme assurance, scheme regulation, and related policy development should be made more clear and undertaken by visibly separate bodies and resourced sufficiently. So in other words, there's just been a bit of a reshuffling of functions to separate the functions of governance. I won't go into more detail now, but you can ask questions later if you like. Next slide, thanks, Ben. On the transparency elements, the panel found that greater transparency would enhance scheme participants and other interested parties, their enhanced understanding, and also the ability to assess and manage potential project impacts and opportunities. So they recommended a suite of changes to improve transparency, like, for example, that carbon estimation areas be published. So this was made to allow third-party assessment of project outcomes. And really, the recommendation is just there to help verify that what we're saying is happening is actually happening. Other recommendations like simplifying scheme documents or improving the accessibility of scheme information are made to make it easier to understand or make a decision about whether you would like to participate in the scheme. So overall, they're really just made to help build trust and help build understanding in the scheme. Next slide, thanks, Ben. One of the biggest changes is this new proponent-led method development framework. And under this model, the government is no longer the sole maker of methods. Instead, methods will be, or it's recommended that methods are developed by project proponents. I'll give you like a brief overview. Again, I won't go into heaps of detail, but essentially, as a proponent, you would agree to the scheme criteria and the requirements that are on the left-hand side of this slide. And then you put in an expression of interest that would be assessed and triaged by the new Carbon Abatement Integrity Committee. So they would assess your expression of interest against the criteria on the left. And if approved, you would begin to develop a new method or a module. You would be supported by the department in this process. And then once you develop the method or module, you submit to the Carbon Abatement Integrity Committee again for a final assessment. The intention behind this model is really to drive innovation in method development and to provide incentives for all emission reduction options. The desired outcome is really that there's more tailored methods and modules to unique circumstances. And by having more tailored options, that would enable higher participation and greater abatement. Next slide, thanks, Ben. A big focus of the panel was making sure the scheme delivered positive outcomes for regional communities and First Nations Australians. So in keeping with principles of free, prior and informed consent, the panel recommended that the conditional registration of projects on native title lands should be removed. And they also recommended that efforts be made to align the scheme with broader reforms that enhance the rights and interests of First Nations Australians, including the Closing the Gap agenda. It was also recommended that there be investment in building trust and understanding in the scheme. Part of this is done by making the scheme information more accessible, and part is done by things like regulation and accreditation of carbon service providers. And that just means if you're a carbon service provider like Upscale Carbon, you can become accredited, and when you speak to a landholder, you can pass on the information that you're upholding best practice in the operation of a project. Another thing that was focused on in the review was increasing understanding of the scheme, and we have a program called the Carbon Farming Outreach Program, which Ben is helping to administer. So I'll just quickly hand over to Ben to inform you of.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I've just got one slide. I'll just acknowledge I'm joining you from Noongar country in WA. So this new Commonwealth program, the Carbon Farming Outreach Program, is all about supporting farmers and land managers to reduce their emissions and sequester carbon. And we're doing this through providing advice from trusted advisors. So there's three main aspects to the program. The first one is we're engaging a service provider to develop a training package. And on the slide there in the left box is some of the things that this training package will cover, but the scope of it hasn't been decided yet. That's going to be part of like the first job of the service provider, to undertake an audit of what's already out there, because there's already a lot of excellent tools available, and also to conduct a in-depth consultation with stakeholders, including industry, First Nations, and other and the state governments, state and territory governments, so that we can capture everyone's needs. And this training will be made available on the department's website. Then the second aspect of it is the grants. So the training service provider will develop a package and then deliver it to other trainers. So it's train the trainer model, and the grantees will be those recipients of that training, who will be trusted advisors, who will then go on to deliver the training package to the farmers and land managers who need the information. And then the third aspect is evaluation. So we want to make sure that the training is fit for purpose. So getting feedback from farmers and land managers and the trainers as well, and making changes to the training program to make sure it's fit for purpose. And then of course we want to be able to show the effects that the outreach program has had, so this can inform hopefully future funding. So that's everything about the Carbon Farming Outreach Program. And then you can contact me. I think my contact details are on this slide somewhere at the end.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, so the next steps in the review, or in the implementation of the review, the government has committed to implementing the recommendations as quickly as possible. A couple have already actually been implemented, but many of the recommendations require further design and consultation because of the impact that they have on the scheme and scheme participants. Early consultation has prioritised recommendations that increase confidence in the integrity of the scheme, methods and projects. But ongoing consultation will be directed very broadly at landholders, communities, industry reps, state, territory, local governments and carbon service providers. So expect to hear more on that in the coming months. And following consultation, the government will introduce installation where it's necessary from July 2023. So that's it from us.
Thank you to everybody that has presented today. That's the end of the presentations. So what I'll do is I'll just do a quick run through of the questions. For everybody that is interested, the presentation will be made available on YouTube. So by the sound of everyone that's here would have registered, which is good. So your emails and everything should be on there. So I can organise to have that emailed out to you as well for anyone that's interested. So we'll start with the questions now. Okay, so I think this one sounds like it might be for Daryl. So from Matthew, how does the Savannah burning ERF reconcile with cultural burning methods of Indigenous peoples? Are you still there, Daryl?
Yes, I am.
Yep. Great, yep. And are they, synergistic or based on different principles?
Look, they broadly are synergistic. I mean, the original Savannah burning method was a partnership between Charles Darwin University and the traditional owner groups of the Northern Territory. So the original concept it started in the mid-90s, and it was that we had all this pattern of late fires, and traditional owners were pointing out, well, we used to burn in the winter, and so we started doing some measurements from the mid-90s onwards, and CDU spent 10 to 15 years, more than that actually, getting the data sets and doing testing that. So the Savannah burning method is definitely informed by First Nations people, and obviously a lot of the projects are run by Indigenous organisations as well, and the Indigenous Carbon Industry Network is a major player in the Savannah burning space. So they certainly are broadly compatible. However, they do have slightly different objectives. I mean, the objective of the Savannah burning is to reduce emissions from strategic fire breaks, whereas cultural burning is more about getting people back on country and doing on-ground burning. They might have some slightly smaller fire scars, and obviously they're not using helicopters. So, but a lot of our helicopter operators are also Indigenous, and that's increasingly the case. So I would say that cultural burning and Savannah burning are compatible, but having said that, slightly different objectives and slightly different methods of implementation. It's very hard to walk across, I mean, the facts are very hard to walk across 10 million hectares of Cape York and burn on foot. So I think what we'll see a continuation of Savannah burning with the helicopter usage, and we'll also see an increase in cultural burning undertaken as part of those projects as well, and cultural walks and the like will expand and continue. So I don't see them, they're certainly not oppositional forces.
Okay, thanks, John. Yeah, that's helpful. Sorry, Daryl.
Yeah, great. Thanks a lot for that, Daryl. So that seems like it's the end of the question. So before I wrap up, does anyone have any other questions, like burning questions that they want answered from the three presenters, because John's not here?
Is that a pun?
Is that a play on words?
I thought I answered the burning question. So
yes, very true. But yeah, everyone else is fine for questions. Yeah.
I've got one for Ben. Just wondering, Ben, the Chubb review situation has obviously held up the 2023 method finalisation for Savannah. Is there any visibility around the process of resolving that, so that the 2023 method can, as you know, it's about 90% completed, 95%. Do you have any visibility on when the method development might continue for Savannah?
Yeah, I think maybe Killin can answer that one.
Yeah, or Alex potentially, if you're available. Yeah, go on.
Yeah. Sorry, everyone, for the technology hiccups. I'll just jump in there. So we are hoping to put out an update on this very shortly. So the government has been developing its approach to implementation, and obviously this is captured in that. And yeah, so we are moving as quickly as we can to get an update out as soon as possible. I'm very happy to facilitate, to pass that on via Leah as soon as that becomes available, if that's useful at all.
Yeah, that'll be great. Yeah.
Yeah, I just had a quick follow-on question from that. Alex, do you know how far away the integrated farm management method is, which stacks methods on top of each other? Because I thought that was due for release in February this year.
Yeah, so essentially it's the same sort of thing. So both of those have sort of fallen subject to the implementation of the recommendations of the shop review. So as I said, we're hoping to get an update on that pretty shortly.
Okay, great. Well, thanks everyone. I'll just share my screen again quickly. All right. So basically, just to wrap up, I just want to say thank you very much to everybody that has presented today. There's a lot of valuable information shared, and thank you for taking time out of your day to be here. And thanks to all the people that attended as well, because obviously without the presenters and the people attending, so I just wanted to let you know, if anyone is interested as well, I'll be hosting another webinar next week on the 28th for emerging weed technology. Again, there'll be 4 presenters talking about different topics. So if anyone's interested in that, you can register on Eventbrite for that as well. And Terrain is also holding a carbon farming workshop on the 19th of April. So if anyone's interested in attending that, if you contact Terrain, they should be able to link you up with that. So does anyone have any further questions before we wrap up the webinar? Sorry, it ran a little bit over time.
I just said one about the alternative soil carbon measurement technologies that are emerging other than drilling cores. And I was just wondering if anyone on today had any update or information on those type methodologies which are being tested right now.
Yeah, look, I'm happy to talk to that. There is quite a fair bit of work going on, particularly research and development in remote sensing of soil carbon and really hybrid-based methods of sort of satellite imagery with physical-based coring. At the heart of it, there will always probably be some sort of physical measurement, whether that's a core or a tower, which we have CO2 flux towers which measure gas exchange, which you could potentially put out there, or some other method of measuring physical CO2 exchange, because then that gives you an indication of what's in the soil. But the emphasis is on reducing the cost of measuring soil carbon, and Ben and Alex will be well aware of this, from about probably $50 or $60 per hectare down to $3 per hectare as part of the Soil Carbon Innovation Challenge. And there is a lot of machine learning and artificial intelligence work to predict soil carbon from space. And while they do come up with flash colourful maps, in all cases, I would strongly advocate being ground truthed with cores and that sort of thing. So the challenge is reducing the number of physical cores to adequately represent the variability in the soil. So if you've got a homogeneous landscape that's perfectly uniform, which there never exists, you would only need to take one soil core. The more variable your soil is in terms of topography and soil types, the more samples you really do need to take, because it's just soil variability reflects the variability in soil carbon. So I hope that answers your question. It might be too philosophical.
No, thanks.
Right. Well, thanks a lot for that. Well, yeah, if no one's got anything else to add, we'll leave it there. And thanks all for attending.
Cheers.
Thanks, everyone.
Great. Thanks a lot.
So, bye.
Bye.